We are talking IRS.
Well, we're actually talking IRS and a bunch of other things. The situation on the $3.5 trillion spending proposal really drove me to this unplugged scenario. That is an enormous amount of money. And let me try to give a real world view of exactly how much money that is. Everybody's either seen or been on a football field. So if you went from end zone to end zone, sideline to sideline, and you built a 3-story, 35-foot tall building across that landmass, and you filled it with $100 bills, not dollar bills, $100 bills, it would take that building to house $3.5 trillion. That's an enormous amount of money. It's a ridiculous amount of money. And the way that we're actually spending money in this country now is, in my humble opinion, absurd based on the way that we're taking in money. Give you an example. We're running almost $1 trillion per year deficit every single year. That deficit is borrowed money that ends up going onto the national debt. The national debt in this country is approaching $29 trillion. So when we start to put all of this in perspective, I don't know how in the hell we're ever going to be able to pay any of this money back, because it's not that we're just borrowing money for programs that make sense. We're running a deficit of $1 trillion a year after all receipts are collected. We're bringing in $3.8 trillion of new revenues that come into the government every year. That's the good news. The bad news is we're spending $4.75 trillion. It would be like anybody in their household that had a budget that's overspending. So what do? You go to the money tree in the backyard. That's what my mother used to call it. Oh, Frank, what are you going to do? You're going to go back out to the money tree? Well, obviously, there's no money tree that exists. But in Washington, the money tree is just adding more to the national debt. And this subject is not being covered properly by any of the networks because they don't even understand it. I want you to roll the tape of a guy by the name of Mark Levin, who's a very, very smart guy on Fox. I don't line up with him politically on almost anything. But I want to play the tape, and then I want to explain what he's trying to say.
First of all, I want people to know this is what 2,500 pages looks like. That is in one bill. And I would ask the American people, do you have any idea what's in this bill? Most of you don't, because the press isn't really telling you, other than a few platitudes. Sean, what I would like to hit on are the lies that we're getting about the debt, about the default, because the Democrats in every one of these debates tries to scare the hell out of the American people. We're going to default on our debt, says Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, says the hacks around Biden, says Nancy Pelosi. We're not going to default on our debt. Let me go through this very quickly. And by the way, I had a caller to my radio show and said, hey, look, if the $5.5 trillion is all paid for at no cost, why are we raising the debt ceiling anyway? So in other words, if the lie is that this isn't going to cost us anything, it's all paid for, why is there even a debate about raising the debt ceiling? The government won't default on debt service because that's what we're talking about. Folks, listen to me carefully. The tax revenue continues. We get about $320 billion in a month, the federal government does, all forms of federal taxation and user fees. And yet the debt service is a little over $44 billion a month. 320, 44. There is way more than enough to pay for the debt service.
320, 44. Mark, you're an intelligent guy. You don't even know what the hell you're talking about. The 44 is part of the borrowing of $1 trillion deficit, which means that you can't even pay your bills, let alone pay the debt service without borrowing more money. This would be like anybody that's out there that's got a $500,000 house, and the next thing you know, you got $3 million loaned against it, and you're never going to be able to pay the $3 million back. It's the same concept. We don't have additional monies to do any of this. We're deficit spending. In the last 50 years, this is an unbelievable stat. Only 4 times in the last 50 years have we not run budget deficits. Let me repeat. in 4 years out of the last 50 are the only times we didn't run budget deficits, and none of it has been recent. And now we want to start blaming, okay? Well, let's start blaming Nixon, Carter, all the way to Trump. You know, this is not one president's problem. It's every president's problem, that we just continue to borrow money that we can't pay back. Now, there's a theory out there, and here's the theory, is that the debt should be tied to the gross domestic product. Well, what's the gross domestic product? The gross domestic product is the product and services that are generated inside the United States of America in all categories, okay? So there's a percentage of the debt that should relate to that. I know that's complicated, but I'm going to make it a lot simpler. The simpler version is every single breathing American, even the ones that are being born as this show is going on, their share of the debt is $86,000 per human being, okay? I want you to think about that. Each American citizen, their share of the debt is $86,000 and growing. They're talking about, if this keeps up by 2024, we're going to have, instead of a $29 trillion national debt, we're going to be over $40 trillion. And like I said, it's not sustainable. Let me go through a couple other things to get people to understand, and I'm going to wrap this up, to get people to understand the totality of this issue. So how does it tie directly to the $3.5 trillion? Well, it doesn't make sense to go borrow another $3.5 trillion for all these other programs. You know, the balanced budget amendment is long gone, so we're not going to get to that. What's a balanced budget amendment? It means whatever you take in, you spend. Now, everybody over on the Democratic side can make the argument, well, then we need to increase taxes. And that's one way of generating revenue. But the way that we're spending money in the United States of America, you could take all the money and you're probably not even going to get to a balanced budget. You're not going to get there. It's too much spending. It's not enough revenues, and somebody's going to have to address it, because the easy thing is that you borrow against it. So in 1971, just a few data points, Richard Nixon abandoned the gold standard. We were on the gold standard until 1971, which meant that money was really based on, you know, how much gold do you have? There was some backdrop to printing money. In 1971, as I mentioned, from 71 to 2021, only 4 times in those years have we ever had not a deficit, a balanced budget for that fiscal year. And the gauge that some people use, as I mentioned again, is this percent to GDP. Even people that argue about it think that at 85%, we're at the top of where we need to be percentage-wise to the national debt. It's well over 100% now. So every indicator is indicating that we don't have the money to do all this. We've got to figure this out. And I would leave on this. I would just say that when you think about it in the terms of what you think about, they just raised the debt ceiling now. And the debt ceiling is the ability to borrow money when all of these $1 trillion are still owed. And they just raised it today, $480 billion to get us, quote unquote, to the end of the year. Okay? We didn't solve anything. All we did is borrow more money. Be like your husband going out and he just keeps borrowing money, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're so underwater you can't see straight. That's the situation that we're in with our country. So I would just suggest that morally, a lot of these social programs are important. We shouldn't be paying people to stay home. We should have a society that ultimately is built on this capitalistic system that is not welfare. Welfare is only for the people that truly need it. And I'm a firm believer we should take care of those people. But people that can work need to get out and work. And that's the whole scenario, I think, that, you know, we've got to really clean up in the country.
And that, I feel like that is a lot to consume, and that is a lot for people to understand. And when you were talking about just each person owing $86,000, I mean, that's a shocking number. I have a question. So if big companies are expected to pay the taxes for this $3.5 trillion. Won't that still trickle down to consumers? Because won't they just raise the price?
It will. I mean, there was a big part of this, Sarah, that, we're going to raise the minimum wage. And the reason that people aren't coming to work in these restaurants, you go to any restaurant in the country, they don't have enough workers.
Right.
So we're trying to raise the minimum wage. Okay, fine. But at some point, the inflation side kicks in, which is kicked in now, and interest rates are going to start rising. And that's a really bad combination. But on the inflation side, I mean, a hamburger could end up costing $15 before we're done.
Right.
So at some point, it all goes back to the consumer. And when inflation hits, the people that I worry about the most are the people that have paid their dues that are on fixed income, the older generation that, really don't have anywhere to turn. They really don't have anywhere to turn. So, the answer is that the inflation side of this also is a very dangerous component that we got to keep our eye on.
So what is, and you kind of said this a little bit theoretically, but what is the answer? I don't know if you can explain this in a few minutes.
I don't know at this point that there's an answer to the national debt. I mean, we cannot pay $30 trillion back. So, some of that is owned by our own treasury. Some of it is owned by foreign entities. Japan and China and others own some of this debt. I really don't know the answer to that one. What I do know the answer to is that I'm for everybody paying their fair share. And if the fair share has to be increased by people and Washington is spending the money properly, I don't think anyone would really care. The problem that people have, I've been very fortunate that I've had the ability to, pay my share of taxes. And, I was happy to do it. You worry about how the money's being spent.
Right.
You worry about, what they're doing with it. And I would say, Sarah, the answer is that on the debt, I don't have an answer. On the balanced budget or getting the budget somewhat in line, is the progressives on the Democratic side, their proposals cannot work. If they work, they're really going to bankrupt our country.
Jeez.
But the clip, I want to get back to this just for a second.
Yeah. The
clip proves that really smart people on network television and cable television really don't even understand the issue. Well, we've got it only takes $44.5 billion to pay the debt. We don't have 44.5.
Right, where's that money
billion.
coming from?
Well, it's coming from borrowing more money. It'd be like you on your credit card.
Yeah.
And the debt ceiling is there so Sarah doesn't overborrow on your credit card. Everybody's got debt ceilings.
Right. Unbelievable. Well, I think you need someone like you in those positions to make those decisions. Someone who has run a business, has had a successful business.
I'm not electable, though. I'm not going to,
Frank for president.
I'm not a politician, but I think that ultimately there are smart people in the country that understand this. I think what you're seeing today is a gigantic divide, though, in the country. We've all known that.
Oh, yeah.
The right wing is over here, and they're not right. The left wing's over here, they're not right. I've said on every show last year, and I'm going to say it every show this year, if we want to govern properly, we have to govern from the center. People have to come together, and we've got to govern from the center. I know this might upset some people on the right, but Bill Clinton, in my lifetime, was the best president that did that. And he's also one of the presidents that had the balanced budget, that one of the 4 in the last 50, he was one of those that actually balanced the budget for that fiscal year. Very, very, very hard to do. But I think that this divide, this political divide and this hate that's in Washington, I think we've got to try to govern from right here.
And it just keeps getting bigger, that divide, which
It does.
is sad to see. Well, Frank, Unplugged is always interesting and always learning, which is excited to hear.